Palestinians thought he was mad. The Palestinians of today are unlike the Palestinians of 1948.
We can often romanticize the struggle of the Palestinians.
This is our land. We are not going anywhere. The Vietnamese resisted, the Algerians resisted, the South Africans resisted. So long as the idea is valid and finds people to carry it, the resistance will continue. The Palestinians are living in open prisons. The Palestinian Authority has been the worst thing that happened to the Palestinians since the Nakba.
The announcement of Donald Trump at the press conference with Netanyahu had all the shock value we expect from a rogue president. But how do we understand the intention to clean out Gaza and turn it into a riviera? And how do Palestinians view the brazen ethnic cleansing on show? Now, to help us understand the subject, we have back on the show Dr Azzam Tamimi, who is one of the leading Palestinian commentators and authors of one of the most authoritative works in the English language of Hamas. Dr Azzam Tamimi, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back to The Thinking Muslim.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Delighted to be back.
Well, thank you for joining us once again. And we're speaking in the week where I think it's not an over-exaggeration to state that there was a wild announcement by Donald Trump together with Benjamin Netanyahu, who, of course, was very happy to hear Donald Trump announce that his intention was to, in effect, occupy Gaza and remove the strip of its Palestinian population and so supposedly resettle them in one of the surrounding countries. It sounds like a very callous plan. I suppose my first question is, how are the Palestinians responding to this announcement?
Well, Palestinians thought he was mad to suggest something like this. Yeah. They've endured 15 months of genocide and remained attached to their ancestral land, and now he thinks he can easily just remove them and turn it into a riviera or something. But you see, putting aside the incoherence of his idea and of the language even he uses, the idea itself is actually a repeat of what the British did more than 80 years ago. This is what they did to the Palestinians between 180 years ago. Because the Palestinians were living there, were living in Palestine, and then the British decided that the Jewish problem of Europe could best be resolved by dispossessing the Palestinians and bringing the Jews to inhabit the land. Yeah. It's not a new idea. It's really what colonialism is about. And it is exactly what happened to the Americas. When the white man of Europe came armed with the Bible, with all sorts of mythical, biblical claims, pretending to be the Israelites and calling the Red Indians, or calling the indigenous population Red Indians and calling them the Canaanites, they depopulated America. Actually, they exterminated the indigenous population. The thing that really comes to mind is that since the end of the Second World War, the world order we've been living under tried to put a more humane face. But now Trump comes and says, stop the hypocrisy. This is what we're going to do because we've been doing it all along. But of course, what the British managed to do 100 years ago is impossible to do today. Yeah. The world is different. We've seen protests and rejections from all quarters for different reasons. Each rejection, people have their own reasons. But above all, the Palestinians of today are unlike the Palestinians of 1948. I think they are much more aware. They've learned from the experience of their grandparents and parents. and they're willing to put up whatever resistance is needed.
I mean, we can often romanticize the struggle of the Palestinians, in particular this last 15 months. We've seen just the sheer resilience of the people of Gaza. But of course, you know, one wonders, the place is now uninhabitable according to the United Nations. It's been destroyed. And even though there will be reluctance, I mean, how many Palestinians, you think, will decide that they may want to leave the Strip because life is unbearable, I suspect, for so many, especially in the northern territories of Gaza?
Well, nobody has asked the Palestinians directly. I mean, we don't have any polls or... the Israelis claim that if you offer the Palestinians a way out, they will all leave, because this is what the Israelis wish to happen. But at least from some of the statements we heard over the media, and not just Al Jazeera, even the CNN, BBC World Service, whichever media that managed to have a representative interviewing people sitting on the rubble, they all rejected the offer. They clearly said, this is our land, we are not going anywhere. Yeah. And what really... the irony here is that Trump claims he wants to solve a problem that the Palestinians have. The problem the Palestinians have been having is the existence of Israel on their land, is the Zionist occupation of their land. And they simply ask this question, why doesn't Trump volunteer to take the Israelis somewhere else instead of offering to remove the Palestinians from their land? After all, these Israelis are mostly of European origin. They never belong to the land, irrespective of whatever false claims they are making to justify the invasion and the occupation. And therefore, they'll probably be much more comfortable in America or in Germany as an act of atonement.
Can you spell out the motivation of the Palestinians? Because I suspect many Westerners, many materialists will probably find it very difficult to understand that mindset that enables people to remain rooted to the land, even though the Israeli war machine has destroyed it. Like explaining words to our Muslims and our non-Muslim viewers what lies behind that level of commitment to the land.
Well, at the basic level, this is not a unique experience. The Palestinians are not the first people on the face of earth or in history to be subjected to such a colonial project. The Vietnamese, the Algerians, South Africans, the nations of Latin America, many nations in Africa and Asia. Now, how many people deserted their homeland because of the hardship the colonial authorities create for them? Very few. Yes, of course, there are a few who, for their own personal reasons, prefer to go somewhere else. But the majority prefer to resist. The Vietnamese resisted, the Algerians resisted, the South Africans resisted. So what the Palestinians are doing is a natural human response, because they are the victims. They've been attacked, they've been invaded. But one can add to this the fact that the majority of the Palestinians are Muslims. And the Muslims have this faith that if you defend your land and if you die in the process of defending your homeland, especially when that homeland has Al-Aqsa, which is the first Qibla of the Muslims and the third holiest mosque on the face of the earth, then the rewards are enormous. That is divine rewards. And if you are killed, you are a martyr. And if you suffer, your suffering will be recompensated very soon. So there is an element of faith here. And that's what we saw in Gaza. People were being hammered day and night, and then when they are asked, how are you? They'll say, Alhamdulillah, praise be to Allah. Many people around the world were astonished. I mean, what's wrong with these people? There's nothing wrong with them, because it is part of their faith that if they undergo a tribulation of any kind, a test, a crisis, whatever, and if they show patience and if they show resilience, then they will be enormously rewarded.
Can you comment on I don't know if it's duplicitous, but the duplicity we see amongst, let's call them liberals in America and Europe, who have stood silent for these last 15 months and have actually helped the Israeli war machine. But after this week's announcement by Donald Trump, have roundly condemned Donald Trump for calling for ethnic cleansing. I mean, there seems to be a problem in the mindset here about when it comes to Palestinians. Just talk to that apparent hypocrisy.
Well, the objection to Trump varies. I mean, why people object? I'm sure that most people object because they find insanity in what he is proposing.
Yeah.
But I think the intellectuals are truly worried that this is marking the end of the world order. They've happily lived under since the end of the Second World War.
But we've had 15 months of genocide where the world order has...
That is true, but that genocide could have been overlooked, could have been, I don't know, justified probably in various ways, especially with the Israeli propaganda that Hamas started it and we are responding, and all the lies about Hamas doing things that they never really did. But remember that this world order claims to be a rules-based order. And now Trump comes to do away with all these rules. So what sort of world are we going to be living under? So even if you didn't care much about the Palestinians, from the point of view of those who really didn't care, they care that today Trump is dismantling the rules-based world order. No longer rule of law, no longer the values of democracy and human rights, no longer any of those values that many Western governments used to put a beautiful face when they deal with the others. So I think there is real concern. This is not what Trump is doing is a very serious thing.
But as you intimated there, it is a charade, and a lot of it is window dressing. You know, what Trump has done or does is similar to what his predecessors have done, but they've shown a nice face. I mean, isn't in a sense what Donald Trump doing better for this world, because he's no more than displaying the true intent of this American empire?
I think the difference is that Trump doesn't care about pretending to be benevolent, pretending to be humanitarian. That is of no concern to him. Whereas the previous administration, in Washington, provided the Israelis with a killing machine, but at the same time paid lip service to human rights, to democracy, and that worked for many years. I mean, America, since the end of the Second World War, has been committing war crimes all over the world. But they always justify this. They're either fighting the communists, or fighting Islamic terrorism, or fighting drug cartels, or doing this or doing that. There is always some sort of an explanation, so that what they're doing doesn't seem to contrast or contradict the rules upon which the world order is based. Now Trump is just shredding all of this. He's putting it down and he's saying, I don't care. I'm going to do it for tourism reasons. And we turn it into a riviera. And while he wants the population of the world to come and enjoy themselves in Gaza, the Palestinians can do whatever they like somewhere else. You see, it is the same racism that we've been complaining from, but I think this time it's entirely unmasked. When the British depopulated parts of Palestine in preparation for the Zionists to come and do the rest for them, when 750,000 Palestinians were removed from their homes in 1948, there was no concern whatsoever for the Palestinians. Yet it was justified in the name of recompensating the victims of the Holocaust. Trump has no justification. He doesn't need justification. Might is right. We can do it, then we will do it. That's the difference.
Can I ask you to comment about the resistance and where it is at the moment? Now, you've written probably one of the most extensive works on Hamas in the English language, and you followed Hamas quite closely in terms of their political and military leaderships. Where is Hamas at the moment, and the resistance in general at the moment? And do you subscribe to the idea that, in a sense, the ceasefire marks the victory of this resistance?
Well, it marks the defeat of the Israelis, because they haven't been able to achieve any of their objectives. Yeah. Now, the resistance movement has been wounded. Yeah. There's no doubt about this. And has been, to a large extent, been maybe stripped of some of its military power.
Yeah.
However, we go back to the same argument that this is an idea, and the idea doesn't die. Now, how intact and how strong the resistance is still today, I'm not sure. I don't know. I have no information. But I was surprised, like many people around the world, to see Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam fighters come out of the rubble, organize the delivery of the Israeli captives in an orderly manner, and putting on a show of force. Despite the fact that most probably, we already know, of course, some of their top leaders have been killed, that most probably a large number of their top leaders have been eliminated. Yet these young men have carried the idea forward. So long as the idea is valid and finds people to carry it, the resistance will continue.
And you talked there about the hostages. Can you talk to the disparity, I suppose, between the treatment of hostages on the Palestinian side and hostages on the Israeli side?
Well, the Palestinians, and the resistance in particular, emanate from the values of Islam in treating the captives. I prefer to call them captives because the Palestinians also are captives in Israeli detention camps. So there are captives here and there are captives here. The Islamic rulings on the treatment of captives has been observed to the full by Hamas and by the other factions that held those captives, because that's part of the Islamic tradition and part of the Islamic faith. And you saw them come out quite well, health-wise. Apparently they were fed well, clothed well, taken care of. Whereas on the other side, the Israelis treat the Palestinians worse than they treat animals. Probably they have a lot more compassion for animals than for the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And we saw that some of the Palestinians actually were coming out of prison like cavemen. Some of them almost at the edge of losing their lives, and They told stories about how they were treated, especially since the 7th of October 2023, how the Israelis were torturing them regularly, how they reduced their food intake, daily food intake, and on the way out of prison, how they humiliated them and beat them constantly until they were free. And here we find two completely different civilizations, two completely different cultures, two completely different visions. I'm not talking here about Islam and Judaism, because I know many Jews who respect human rights, who respect human dignity, and who condemn Zionism like we do condemn it exactly. But Zionism itself is a movement, is an ideology that is anti-human, that is so racist, supremacist, that doesn't see that the other deserves to be treated as a full human being. And that's the difference. Whereas in Islam, whether you like the other person or not, Islam tells you how you have to treat them. وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا اعْدِلُوا هُوَ أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَى. Do not let your dislike of people make you swerve away or make you treat them unfairly. Be fair, be just. That's closer to piety. That's an Islamic principle. Whereas Zionism believes that if you are a Zionist, you are superhuman, you have divine qualities and a divine license to kill the other, to take their land, and to do to them whatever you like.
I mean, much of what we've seen over the last 15, 16 months, especially in the last few weeks, is the command of the narrative. And I think it's fair to say that the narrative has swung away from the Israelis and moved in a very positive direction, which we haven't seen before. But the narrative that the Palestinians are uncivilized still is maintained, especially in the mainstream media. I mean, how do you assess, I suppose, the point about the narrative and where it stands at the moment, but also in a greater way? I mean, how can we counter this this sort of barbarism versus civilization narrative that many of the Western press still maintain, even though the reality is obvious in front of them?
I think the problem we have is that the mainstream media in the West is not free.
No.
When it comes to Palestine, they are under constraint, they are under control. I'll give you an example. I was watching the BBC World Service yesterday when I was in Rotterdam, and there was a lady interviewed in the studio. And the lady was referring to the ICJ and the ICC, these two top courts, world courts, and the conviction, the ruling that Netanyahu and others in Israel are accused of genocide, of war crimes. And the presenter was terrified. She immediately responded saying, well, the Israelis would respond and say that they do not accept these charges.
Yeah.
When the BBC does not have respect for the two highest courts in the world, I mean, what remains of integrity, of honesty, and of decency in the mainstream media? And I think what changed the balance in terms of whose narrative is more acceptable or more authentic is the independent media, the social media, and the young men and women around the world who have defied the establishment. They've gone against their own establishments, against their own university managements, and tried to open the eyes of the world to see that the Palestinians have always been the victims and that the Zionists have always been the aggressors. And I think this is what has made the difference. And this has pushed certain segments of the mainstream media to realign. Because we've seen a slight change, whether we're talking about the CNN or BBC or Sky or whatever, or even the newspapers, the main newspapers around the world, under pressure from the independent media outposts, they had to realign themselves.
Returning back to Donald Trump's announcement, there is speculation that Donald Trump, as a means to negotiate, starts with a maximalist position, a very hardline position, and then negotiates down. And so the assessment is that he insists on this clearing out project of Gaza, not as a final goal, as an intent, but rather as leverage over regional players and over Hamas and the Palestinians. I mean, how much do you buy that analysis?
Look, what Trump has said may ironically have completely adverse effects. Look at the response of some of the strongest allies of the United States of America in the Middle East.
Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia in particular. Yeah. I was listening, of course, there's Prince Turki Faisal has been outspoken in this regard. And yesterday, I was listening to a Saudi journalist speaking from Jeddah. And this is what he said to Trump. Instead of removing the Palestinians from their homeland, why don't you take the Israelis away and have them settle somewhere else? Yeah. For the Saudis, and of course, a journalist in Saudi Arabia wouldn't be speaking to an international outlet like the BBC without consent from the higher authorities. I think Trump has annoyed almost everybody in the region and probably more around the world, because it's just unbelievable what he has proposed. Not only that, I think his business like thinking doesn't give him the chance to assess the likely repercussions. Any attempt to remove the Palestinians from Gaza by force or from the West Bank by force is likely to engulf many more countries in the region in the war, instead of keeping it restricted to Gaza or to Jenin or to Tulkarm. And I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Trump will realize this in a few days and will change his mind like he did on other issues.
Dr. Tamimi, I was speaking to Abdullah al-Auda, the son of Salman al-Auda, recently, and he said to me that there is no real willingness within the Saudi establishment, in particular with MBS, who's now the de facto strongman of Saudi Arabia, to really cut a deal which leads to some form of justice for Palestinians. But you know, more so that many of these soundings are leverage for Saudi interests. In particular, they want this NATO-style peace agreement with the Americans. Do you believe that the Saudis are going to normalize in spite of the Palestinians and their claims?
I don't think they will normalize if they believe that the deal on the table might threaten their own existence. Today, Trump suggested that Palestine should be in Saudi Arabia. Imagine, I mean.
Yeah.
What would be the response of the Saudis in this regard? If you bring the Palestinians into Saudi Arabia, you think that will keep the regime stable?
Yeah.
That's how they're thinking. They want stability. They want to remain in power. They're not doing it out of love for the Palestinians. They're doing it because they now feel that Trump has gone well beyond what is acceptable. Of course, Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, Sisi, King Abdullah of Jordan, and many others in the region would probably have been ready to do business with Trump, but not in this way. Trump is not giving them leeway. He's just gone beyond imagination.
And so on that subject, Egypt and Jordan, of course, the Americans do have leverage over these countries, military aid and trade. How much do you think? At the moment, they're very clear they do not want the repatriation of Palestinians to their countries. But how much do you think the Americans have leverage over these governments and can use that leverage.
Well, the Americans have had a lot of leverage, but now what they're doing, they're telling these countries, we're proposing something that might finish you off. So how can you accept something like this?
Yeah.
And the expulsion of the people of Gaza will certainly be followed by the expulsion of the people of the West Bank. Because if there is a precedent, that will be followed on. And there will be no more Hashemites in Jordan. The nature of Egypt will change. And the Palestinians, no matter where you put them, they'll never forget that Palestine is their homeland. They will continue to work for the return. And you look at the world now. Palestinians live in Australia as Australian citizens, in America as American citizens, in Britain as British citizens, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, everywhere. There are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Latin America. When it comes to Palestine, they'd work for the return to Palestine. It doesn't disappear, it doesn't go away. But Trump's idea creates problems for his own allies, and I think that's why they are worried.
It's now become conventional wisdom that Donald Trump was, in a sense, the main trigger behind the ceasefire agreement, and pushed, if not cajoled, Netanyahu to sign that ceasefire agreement. Now, with this recent announcement and the condition that Trump has set that Palestinians have somehow got to leave their land, I mean, how do you see the prospect of that second phase of the ceasefire holding? I mean, is it very plausible that the Israelis will use this as an excuse to once again destroy Gaza?
I think it's become apparent now that Trump's idea about taking Gaza and removing the Palestinians was probably not a sudden thing.
Yeah,
it didn't come out of the blue. It must have been thought over between him and some of his closest Zionist allies in Israel as well as in the White House. And that now makes me think that most probably when he pressed for a ceasefire agreement to be made, he had in mind that once the hostages are retrieved, then we can go back to war. And that's why now Netanyahu is speaking that language. He's talking in these terms. But I wonder, I mean, these people never learned lessons. I mean, what more can they do to the people of Gaza? What more destruction can they bring about in order to bring them down to their knees? 15 months of genocide didn't do it. So how many more months will they do it again?
Can I turn to the West Bank? Because of course, the West Bank there's been very worrying signs of tensions in the West Bank, including with the PA, and we spoke about this briefly in our last conversation. Trump did say that he's mooted the idea that the sovereignty of the West Bank could be given to the Israelis. How anxious are you, I suppose, that the West Bank is next?
It is definitely next.
Yeah.
And I had my suspicion that Netanyahu agreed to the ceasefire because most probably he was promised the annexation of the West Bank.
Wow.
Now, in reality, much of the West Bank had already been annexed, even if not officially. But in day-to-day practice, the Palestinians are living in open prisons throughout the West Bank. It's been cut into pieces, shredded. Life is hellish. And now the Israelis can enter any area and start destroying houses like they did in Gaza. And Netanyahu has his coalition partners to appease. So he's trying to reassure them in order to maintain the cohesiveness of his government, that he has not given up on the various religious Zionist dreams, if one may call them so. So yes, the people of the West Bank are very anxious. They expect the worst. But at the same time, I think the majority of the Palestinians will just resist.
And the role of the Palestinian Authority in what's happened over the last few months, as well as the action that the Israelis have taken in Jenin and other places in the West Bank. I mean, again, we briefly spoke about this in our last conversation. But how do you rate or assess the actions of the Palestinian Authority over this last year and a half?
The Palestinian Authority has been the worst thing that happened to the Palestinians since the Nakba. Had it not been for the existence of the Palestinian Authority, much of what the Israelis have done to the West Bank, they could never have done. The confiscation of land, the demolition of houses, the banishment of people, the uprooting of olive trees, the burning of crops, the building of settlements and the expansion of existing settlements, all these actions are possible because they have a Palestinian body that provides protection for the Israeli troops as well as for the settlers while they're committing all these crimes against humanity. So the Palestinian Authority is just is a scandal. As I said, it's the worst thing that ever happened to the Palestinians.
Finally, I want to ask you a question, maybe more closer to home. Ramadan is coming up, and many within the Muslim community will be turning to spiritual practice and wanted to gain closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And, you know, of course, we've had this year and a half of genocide. And I don't know, I mean, often we start to demarcate our personal from the global and separate our justice-related activities to our personal ibadat and spiritual activities. How does one remain consistent spiritually, internally, but at the same time remain wedded to these Islamic concepts of justice, which require them to think politically and require them to engage in activism and boycotts and the rest of it?
It's really a question of what one understands Islam to be. And what does it mean to be a Muslim? For the early generation of Muslims during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the month of Ramadan, the month of fasting, and the month of Taraweeh, and the month of all these social, special social activities, was also the month of jihad. The major battles in defense of justice, in defense of truth, and in defense of the Ummah took place in Ramadan. So a true Muslim would not separate between acts of spirituality and acts of jihad in defense of the Ummah. And I think this is what we need to rebuild, especially among the young generation. Okay, the older generation, may Allah be with them. I mean, if people are used to a certain lifestyle, it's difficult to change it after 50 or 60 years. But I think young Muslim men and women need to go back to the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ to grasp what it means to be a Muslim, truly. Is it really enough to just fast the month of Ramadan and at night go and do the Taraweeh in one of the mosques and then feel happy about having done my bit, while our brothers, not only in Palestine but around the world, are being subjected to all sorts of atrocities? Or I need to think of something more positive in terms of my duty toward the Ummah. And one of the early things that we need to do is to come together in order to counter the actions of the Zionist lobby in this country as well as in the West in general. We are being silenced. We are being intimidated into not expressing support for justice around the world. And something has to be done about this. We have to be defiant. Yesterday, my lecture in Rotterdam was supposed to be at the University of Rotterdam. And then under pressure from the Zionist lobby, the university cancelled it. And it had to be held in one of the local mosques. What is the role of the Muslim community in this regard? Do we allow universities and other establishment institutions to get away with closing avenues in our face and placing restrictions on us? We are not committing a crime. We are simply standing by truth and justice, and we want the world to hear our side of the story. That's all we're doing. Nobody is resorting to violence or to terrorism, God forbid, or to any such things. Yet, the establishment, with all its official as well as unofficial institutions, is bringing pressure, is placing pressure on the Muslim community and Muslim individuals across Europe. Young men and women in the Muslim community need to come together and enter into coalition with others who may not be Muslim, but who are justice supporters, and let's form a global movement against this injustice.
Can I follow up on that? And I get questions from young Muslims who say that, and maybe this comes from some scholars within our community, that we don't have the spiritual tools or we haven't refined our spiritual character sufficiently enough to be involved with activism. So there is this linear conveyor belt that one needs to first have a level of iman and taqwa before one gets involved with politics and activism. Is that how you see, as someone who's experienced the Muslim community for many decades here in the West, is that how you see Islam and justice?
Now, those who make such preposterous claim, do they have a means of measuring spirituality, that if you reach a certain level, then you can go and perform jihad? That's ridiculous. Khalid ibn al-Walid, who fought against Islam, as soon as he embraced Islam, he became a warrior for Islam. He didn't go into a school of spirituality and entered into a circle or a halaqah or an usra and spend years of educating himself before he defended the truth and justice. Spirituality is needed all the time, and that is a continuous process. But at the same time, you have to be active. You cannot stand helpless and motionless while the oppressors are persecuting their victims the way we see in Palestine and elsewhere in the world. That's not acceptable. That's not the Islam I understand.
If there was one piece of advice you could give to a young Muslim who is trying to reacquaint and get closer to their deen and Islam during the month of Ramadan, apart from reading Quran and fasting and doing acts that bring them closeness and nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of ibadat, what is the one thing you would recommend they do to sharpen their understanding of this deen?
Well, proper knowledge to start with, and also the espousal of the concept of solidarity. As a Muslim, you are supposed to express solidarity toward your brethren, your fellow Muslims who are oppressed in the world. That's part of the deen. That cannot be postponed. So how do we come about vitalizing or energizing this concept of solidarity? If we want to express solidarity toward the Palestinians, how do we do it? We need to come together, sit and think, listen to experts, join hands, build coalitions, and see how we can change things for the better, so that solidarity is delivered somehow. But to say that there's nothing we can do and I'm content just sitting in a corner in a mosque and reciting the Quran, which is, of course, beautiful and needed, and doing all the other rituals, which is a must, of course. And then I don't have to do anything else. No, solidarity has to come into the equation, has to be part of the process.
Azzam Tamimi, Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for your time today.
Jazakallah khairan.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkinmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.